The world as we know it can change in an instant. 1 second, you're moving through life, assuming everything is normal, and the next, your reality is shattered. This is the story of that moment, the moment when everything I thought I knew came undone. When I realized that what we're seeing, what we're feeling, it's all a lie. The storm is already here. I never saw it coming. It started as a typical Saturday morning. The sky was clear, the breeze was cool, and everything felt just right. I was out on my bike, as I usually am on weekends, pushing myself down the empty roads outside of town. There's something about the rhythm of pedaling, the wind whipping past, that clears my mind. It's my time, my escape. It's when I reflect on everything, my work, my family, my life. I had a sermon to prepare for that evening, a sermon about hope, about how no matter how crazy the world gets, no matter how dark it seems, we can always find light. It was supposed to be comforting, reassuring, the usual pastor stuff, right? But that morning, something was different. As I coasted down the hill, feeling the rush of the wind in my face, I felt a shift, a sense that something was coming, something big. But I had no idea how right I was. The hill seemed endless. The air was crisp. The world around me was peaceful, almost surreal. I thought, maybe that's why I didn't see it coming. Maybe that's why I didn't hear the screech of the truck's tires until it was too late. One moment, I was speeding down that hill, my heart racing with the thrill of it all. The next moment, I was gone. It wasn't like floating upwards to a bright light or seeing my life flash before my eyes like you hear in other near-death stories. No, it felt more like being pulled from reality, like someone had yanked me out of my body and dropped me somewhere else entirely. I didn't feel fear, not at first. I felt nothing. 1 second, I was alive, riding my bike down a hill, and the next, I was standing in the middle of a scene I couldn't comprehend. The world around me was all wrong. I was standing in the middle of a city, my city, but everything was twisted. The buildings were no longer standing tall. They were crumbling, leaning to one side as if they'd been struck by a massive force. The streets were cracked, torn apart like someone had come through with a wrecking ball, smashing everything in its path. The air was thick with smoke, so thick I could taste it. It burned my throat. And the heat, it was suffocating. It wasn't just the sun, it was the heat from the fires that raged all around me. Everywhere I looked, I saw flames licking at the edges of the broken buildings. There were explosions in the distance, the sound of glass shattering, the screams of people running in terror. The chaos was unlike anything I had ever seen. It wasn't just a disaster, it was an invasion. I looked around, trying to make sense of it all, trying to find some semblance of familiarity in the twisted mess of it. But I couldn't. The streets were unfamiliar, the buildings foreign. It was like someone had taken my city, shattered it, and then set it on fire. The very air felt wrong. It wasn't just the smoke. It was the feeling of danger, of impending doom. And that's when I saw them, soldiers, marching down the street. But they weren't our soldiers. They didn't have the American flag on their uniforms. No. These soldiers wore foreign insignias, Russian, Chinese, flags from countries I couldn't even recognize. They moved in formation, their steps synchronized, like they knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't a group of soldiers lost in a foreign land. No. These soldiers were here with one purpose, to take control. I couldn't comprehend it. This wasn't a war that was happening over there. This was happening here, in my country. The streets I walked on, the buildings I knew, all of it was now in the hands of foreign forces. It wasn't a far-off war. It was a war we were already losing, and we didn't even know it. I didn't know how to react. I wanted to run, to scream, to fight back. But my body didn't move. I was frozen. The weight of what I was seeing pressed down on me like 1,000 pounds. I tried to call out, to ask someone what was happening, but my voice was lost in the screams and explosions. There was too much noise, too much chaos. And then I saw it. The thing that made it all too real. A tank. It rolled down the street, crushing everything in its path, moving as though it owned the city. This wasn't a Hollywood movie. This wasn't some staged scene in a war film. This was real. The tank was real, and the soldiers were real, and the flags they carried, the ones that should have never been in my country, were real. My heart raced. This was no longer just a vision, no longer just some bad dream. This was happening, and I was standing right in the middle of it. I tried to move, to think, to do something, anything, but all I could do was watch. Watch as the city crumbled, watch as the soldiers marched, watch as my country fell apart before my eyes. It was too much. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Not here, not in my lifetime. But it was happening, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The air around me thickened as the reality of the situation sank in. The heat from the fires, the deafening chaos, and the sense of imminent destruction flooded my senses. I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing, but deep down, I felt something primal stir inside of me. This wasn't just an attack. It wasn't just a war that we'd somehow gotten caught in. No, this was the end of everything I had known. The world I had taken for granted, the peace, the safety, the normality, was slipping away, piece by piece, as the city around me was torn apart. I was in the middle of it all, helpless, paralyzed by fear, but also overwhelmed by the urgency to act, to do something, anything. But what could I do? I wasn't a soldier, I wasn't a fighter, I was just a man, trying to survive in a world that no longer made sense. I glanced around frantically. The streets were lined with debris, shattered glass, twisted metal. Smoke hung thick in the air, a suffocating cloud that clung to everything it touched. People were running, no, sprinting past me. Their faces were filled with fear, their eyes wide with panic, but they were moving too fast for me to stop. Everyone was running toward the same destination, but where were they going? What were they running from? I had to move. I had to find a way out, or at least figure out what was going on. My body reacted before my mind could even catch up. I ran, pushing through the crowd, dodging debris, narrowly avoiding a falling chunk of concrete as it crashed to the ground behind me. But even as I ran, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being pulled into something far worse than I could comprehend. I made it to an intersection and stopped, momentarily lost in the madness around me. Cars were overturned, burning in the streets, their tires still smoldering. Buildings loomed overhead, twisted and broken. This wasn't just a war zone, it was the destruction of everything, the death of an entire way of life. I had been trained to preach hope, to speak of salvation, but now, faced with this, I could find no words. There was no comfort here. And then I saw them again. More soldiers. The same foreign insignias, the same cold, calculated movements. They were moving in perfect formation, like they had done this before, like they had planned it. But this wasn't an invasion that had just started. This was the final strike. This was the takeover. A gut-wrenching thought hit me like a wave. This was real. This was not a distant war. This was not something happening on the other side of the world. This was here. This was in my backyard. This was the end of everything. I turned to face a group of people nearby, hoping for answers, but their eyes were just as terrified as mine. There was no one to turn to, no one with the knowledge to help us. Everyone was on their own, fighting to survive. But then something caught my attention. A scream, a desperate cry for help. I looked down the street and saw a family trapped under rubble. An older man and woman struggling to free their children. They were pinned down, struggling to breathe as the smoke choked them. It was instinct. I couldn't just stand there. I couldn't do nothing. I ran toward them, shouting for help, hoping someone would hear me. But there was no one. The crowd had scattered, leaving me alone to try and save these people. I reached the family, my hands trembling as I tried to move the debris. I managed to shift a few rocks, but the weight was too much. I needed more help. I shouted again, but no one came. The explosions in the distance grew louder, closer. The world was closing in around me. And then, everything went black. It wasn't like falling asleep. It wasn't like slipping into a dream. It was more like being pulled into the darkness, a void that swallowed everything around me. The noise, the chaos, the world I had just been a part of, it was all gone. I was weightless. For a moment, I thought I was dead. For a moment, I thought that maybe the world had ended for me. But then, a sharp, painful sensation tore through my chest, a reminder that I was still here, still alive, somehow. And when my eyes opened again, I wasn't where I had been. I wasn't in the middle of that destroyed city anymore. I was in a different place entirely. I stood up, disoriented. The air around me was cold, but it was more than that. It felt wrong. I wasn't just in a different location. I wasn't in the same reality. I had been transported somewhere else. A place that I didn't understand. A place that felt both familiar and utterly foreign. The streets were quiet. Too quiet. No chaos. No explosions. No people running for their lives. But it didn't feel peaceful. It felt empty, like the calm before a storm. And then I saw them again. The soldiers. But this time they weren't marching through a city on fire. No, this time they were standing in the shadows, watching. Watching me. Watching us. Watching everything. They had no interest in helping. They weren't even there to talk. They were there to observe. To wait. I felt their eyes on me, and I knew. This was no accident. This was no random vision. This was a warning. A warning for what was to come. The silence was suffocating. The emptiness of it all clung to the air like a weight, making every breath feel harder than the last. I wasn't in that devastated city anymore, but I wasn't exactly free from it either. The feeling that I was being watched, scrutinized by unseen eyes, pressed down on me. I stood still for a moment, taking in the environment, trying to make sense of what was happening. The streets were clean, unnervingly so. No debris, no rubble. But there was something eerie about the perfection of it. It felt too quiet, too neat, as though the chaos I'd witnessed was just a memory, a faded nightmare. The world felt frozen in time, the kind of stillness that makes you second-guess your own thoughts, wondering if everything you see is real or if you've lost your mind. I forced myself to take a step forward, the crunch of my shoes on the pavement breaking the silence. It echoed louder than it should have, as though the world was holding its breath with me. My heart beat harder in my chest, a steady rhythm of panic I couldn't escape. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay still. Not in a place like this. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what I had just witnessed, what I was still trying to understand. The soldiers, the foreign flags. This wasn't just a vision. This wasn't some vague warning from my subconscious. This was real. This was happening. The future, the one I'd seen in those shattered streets, was closer than I could have ever imagined. I could feel it, deep in my bones. It wasn't coming in some far-off year. It was coming now. It was already here. But as I stumbled forward, unsure of where to go, I saw it. Movement in the distance. It was faint at first, just a flicker in the shadows, but it was enough. I wasn't alone. Someone else was here. Someone, something, was out there. My breath hitched, and I instinctively stepped back into the shadows, my body tense. I didn't know what to expect. The soldiers had been gone, but that didn't mean the danger was. The air felt thick with the possibility of threat, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into something far worse than I understood. I crept toward the edge of a building, my body pressed close to the wall as I peered around it. What I saw stopped me cold. There, in the distance, was a group of people. They moved slowly, deliberately, but there was no urgency in their steps. They were walking through the streets like it was any other day, their expressions blank, indifferent. It felt wrong. These people, these figures, had no fear, no urgency in their movements. I watched them, trying to make sense of it. I thought they were survivors, but they didn't seem like survivors. They didn't have the look of desperation, of panic, that everyone else in that city had. No, they had the look of resigned acceptance. It was as if they knew what was coming, and they were just waiting for it to unfold. I took a deep breath and stepped out from my hiding spot, cautiously moving toward them. There was a flicker of hope in my chest, a hope that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't alone, that someone else could explain this, that someone else could help me understand what was going on. But the closer I got, the more I felt it. Something wasn't right. They weren't normal people. No, There was something off about them. It wasn't just the calmness in their demeanor. It was their eyes, cold, unblinking, as if they had seen too much already, as if they had been broken. I hesitated. I wanted to turn back, but something pulled me forward, some instinct telling me that these people held the answers, that if I didn't find out who they were, I might never get the chance. So I pushed forward, stepping into their path. One of them, an older man with a weathered face, a bandana wrapped around his head, glanced at me as I approached. His eyes were unreadable, and for a split second, I felt like he was sizing me up, measuring whether I was worth his time. But then he spoke, his voice low and gruff. "You're not from here, are you?" His tone was flat, like he'd said this 1,000 times before, to 1,000 other lost souls. I swallowed hard. "No, I don't know where I am. I don't understand what's going on." The man nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting this. He motioned for me to follow him, and without saying another word, he turned and walked ahead. I had no choice but to follow. Something told me that this man, this group, knew something I didn't, something that might explain everything that had happened. As we walked, the world around us seemed to melt away. The buildings that had once been pristine now looked worn, abandoned. It wasn't just the decay, it was the emptiness that struck me. There was no one here, no life except the handful of people we passed. It was as if everything had been erased, like the city itself had given up. We reached a door, an old, rusted metal door at the back of a building. The man knocked twice, paused, and then knocked again. The door creaked open, revealing a small group of people huddled inside. They looked like they had been here for a long time, dirty, weary, but resolute. They didn't ask who I was. They didn't need to. They already knew. The man who had led me in spoke to them, but I couldn't hear what he said. He didn't need to explain. They knew who I was, too. They knew exactly why I was here. And that's when I understood. This wasn't just a place of refuge. This wasn't just a group of survivors. This was the last stand, the resistance, the ones who had seen it all, the fall of the country, the rise of the foreign forces, the collapse of everything we had known. They were the ones who had decided to fight back. I was in the heart of the resistance, and there was no turning back now. The door slammed shut behind me, sealing off the outside world as I stepped into the dimly lit room. The air inside was thick with the scent of stale food and the unmistakable odor of sweat and desperation. A flickering light above barely illuminated the faces of those around me. These people, the resistance, were no longer the hopeful, determined individuals they once had been. Now, they were weary souls, burned out by years of struggle, pushed to the edge by the overwhelming force they were fighting against. The man with the bandana motioned for me to sit, and I obeyed, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling crawling under my skin. I wasn't sure what to expect, but one thing was certain. The life I knew was gone. These people, these survivors, were no longer just fighting for freedom. They were fighting for the very survival of everything we had once held dear. The world I knew, the country I had trusted in, was being erased. And the question that haunted me as I sat there in the dark was, could this resistance even hold on long enough to stop what was coming? I was barely settled when Maya, the leader of this ragtag group, stepped into the room. She was a tall woman, with a face that had seen more than its fair share of suffering. Her eyes, though, those eyes were sharp, calculating, like a hawk sizing up its prey. She walked with purpose, like someone who knew the weight of every decision they made. There was no hesitation in her steps, no sign of fear. She had lived through this longer than anyone, and her hardened expression showed it. "You're here because you saw it," Maya said flatly. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, one that I had no choice but to accept. She knew. Somehow she knew what I had seen, what I had been part of. I nodded, swallowing hard. I don't understand. I don't understand any of this. What's happening to my country? Why are they here? Why are they winning? Maya looked at me for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then, slowly, she sat down across from me, as though weighing every word she was about to say. Because they've been preparing for this. For years. We've all been asleep, thinking we were untouchable. But we weren't. The cracks were there, Daniel. And they've been filling those cracks with power, with control, for years. Her words hung in the air like a weight I couldn't escape. She was right. I had seen it. I had felt it in the back of my mind, that quiet suspicion that we were drifting toward something dangerous, something unstoppable. But I had ignored it. I had thought it was paranoia, the overactive imagination of someone who spent too much time thinking about the future. But the truth was worse than any nightmare I had ever conjured. "Tell me what you know," Maya said, her voice cutting through the thick silence. "Tell me everything. What did you see?" And I did. I told her everything. The crash, the city in ruins, the foreign soldiers marching through the streets, the flags I never thought I would see in my country. I told her about the tank, the family pinned under rubble, and the darkness that swallowed me whole. And when I finished, Maya didn't flinch. She didn't look surprised. She had heard it before. "We've seen it too," she said softly. "We've been living it for months. The invasion isn't a single event, Daniel. It's been a slow burn, a series of calculated moves. The control of our tech, our infrastructure, our communication, it's all been compromised. We were cut off before most of us even realized what was happening." The room seemed to shrink, the weight of her words pressing in from every direction. It wasn't just an invasion of troops. It wasn't just foreign soldiers marching through our cities. This was an invasion on a scale we couldn't fathom. The enemy didn't need to send in their armies in full force. They didn't need tanks or bombs. No, they had already won before the first shot was fired. It was the control, the power they had over everything we relied on. Our communication networks, our electricity, our supply chains. They had infiltrated everything quietly, without our noticing, until it was too late. And now we were left scrambling, trying to catch up, trying to survive in a world that had already slipped through our fingers. I looked around the room at the people gathered there, people who had seen the collapse, who had fought back, and who were still fighting, despite the odds. They were the few, the desperate, the brave, and the broken. But even as they sat there, whispering amongst themselves, there was a fire in their eyes. It was a spark that hadn't been snuffed out yet, no matter how much the world had tried to crush them. "We've been infiltrated from within," Maya continued. "This isn't just a war against foreign powers. It's a war against ourselves. The enemy didn't need to storm our shores. They've been inside waiting. And now they're ready to strike. The alliance is here, and they're not going anywhere." Her words hit me like a punch. I knew what she meant. The soldiers I had seen in that vision, the ones with the Russian, Chinese, and other flags, they were just the visible part of the storm. The true danger was hidden in the systems, in the people who had already sold out their own country. The traitors, the sympathizers, those who had allowed this to happen, who had helped it along, or worse, had been waiting for it to happen. "But what can we do?" I asked, my voice breaking, desperate for an answer. "How do we fight back? We're already losing." Maya looked at me, her eyes hard and full of a determination that scared me. "We fight, Daniel. We fight with whatever we have left. We don't give up. We don't let them win. And we start by waking people up before it's too late." She stood up, motioning for the group to gather. "This isn't just about survival anymore. It's about taking back what's ours. And we're not going to do it alone. We can't. We have to gather strength. We have to find the others who still care, who still have the fire to fight. But first, we need to make sure they're not already too far gone." And with that, the plan was set into motion. The resistance was no longer just a handful of people hiding in the shadows. It was a movement, a call to arms. We spent the next few hours in that dim room, gathering what little information we had, exchanging whispers, and sharing news of the scattered remnants of our country. But even as we made our plans, a sense of dread lingered in the air. There was no clear path ahead, just the promise of survival, of fighting against something that felt unstoppable. Yet we fought on, because it was the only choice we had left. Maya's voice kept echoing in my mind. "We fight, Daniel. We fight with whatever we have left." And I had to believe that. I had to believe that we still had something worth fighting for, that there was still hope, even if it was buried under layers of darkness and fear. The resistance had been preparing for months, slowly gathering allies, trying to form connections with whatever remnants of the military were still standing. But the forces they faced, the alliance, were everywhere, controlling everything. The lines between friend and foe had blurred. The infiltrators had already taken hold of our technology, our communication, our energy grids. The world was different now. The country I had grown up in, the one I had taken for granted, was slipping away. I stepped out into the streets once more, my heart heavy with the weight of what I had seen and the terror of what was to come. The resistance had shared their plans. They had a few safe houses scattered across the city, places where we could regroup, rebuild, and resist. But the path was treacherous, and every step we took carried the risk of death, of being discovered by the enemy. I was a pastor. I was supposed to bring comfort, hope, salvation. But right now, what could I offer? What comfort could I give to the people who had lost everything, who were fighting for a future that seemed impossible to imagine? As we walked through the wreckage of what had once been a thriving city, I couldn't help but think back to the vision I had seen, to the darkness that had swallowed everything I knew. It wasn't just the destruction, it was the feeling of it all, the certainty that this was a world already lost, already slipping into chaos. And that realization hit harder than any explosion ever could. We moved through the alleys, sticking to the shadows, our every movement careful, calculated. Every step was a gamble. Every corner could bring us face to face with the enemy. We couldn't trust anyone who didn't wear our insignia, who didn't share our fight. This wasn't just an invasion. This was a war against everything. A war against truth, against freedom, against our very right to exist as we had before. I glanced at the people around me, at the faces of the resistance fighters who had joined us, who had taken up arms despite their fear, despite the knowledge that we were already losing. There was no turning back now. For better or worse, we were in this together, and we would go down fighting. A sudden noise from ahead made me freeze. The sound of boots, soldiers. We had to move quickly. I motioned for the others to follow me as we ducked into a narrow alley, hiding in the shadows. The footsteps grew louder, closer. My breath caught in my throat as the sound of military boots approached. The tension was suffocating. The sound was almost unbearable. The soldiers were so close now, I could hear their voices murmuring, their commands sharp and cold. We held our breath, pressing ourselves against the damp walls, praying that they wouldn't see us. The minutes stretched on endlessly, the sound of the soldiers' footsteps filling the air, echoing in the silence of the alley. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the footsteps faded. They were gone. The danger had passed, for now, but the weight of it lingered, hanging over us like a shadow. And that's when I realized something I hadn't been able to see until this moment. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for our very souls, for everything we had believed in, for everything that made us human. The resistance was not just a movement. It was a rebellion against a world that had gone dark, a world that had been consumed by fear, by control. It was a rebellion against the lie that had been fed to us for so long, that we were safe, that we were untouchable. The battle wasn't just for the future. It was for the past that had been stolen from us, that had been crushed under the weight of lies and betrayal. It was for the memories of the world we had lost, the world we still believed in. A world where freedom meant something. A world where hope wasn't just a word. A world where we could stand together, side by side, and rebuild. We weren't just fighting for survival anymore. We were fighting for the truth, for the freedom to choose our own path, for the freedom to exist in a world that hadn't been twisted by foreign powers, by traitors, by the forces that sought to tear us apart. And even though the odds were stacked against us, even though we were up against an enemy that seemed unbeatable, I knew something that kept me moving forward, something I would never let go of. We were still here, and as long as we were still here, we would fight, no matter the cost.